Good morning, Honors World History. Obviously, this is your teacher, Mr. Smith, and I'm coming to you from my living room. Who'd have thought that I could be able to lecture to you guys from my living room? But with all the new technology we've received, I thought we would give it a try. So, you guys currently have a nice, beautiful chart, probably sitting in front of you in your notebook, that asks you to come up with the main idea of 6 Enlightenment thinkers, and then to understand the impact on the development of the United States government. That's what we're going to be doing in this lecture. We're going to be talking about the history of the American Revolution, as well as the impact of Enlightenment ideas on the American Revolution. Those are your two big objectives right here. What Enlightenment ideas sparked the American Revolution? So we're going to be giving you a little bit of historical context and things like that, as well as what Enlightenment ideas led to the creation of the U.S. Declaration of Independence and Constitution. So those are our big objectives for today. Let's jump right in and get started. We are likely to experience technological delays and or difficulties, seeing as how this is the first time, but we're going to give it a try. All right, so the American Revolution gave birth to the first modern republic. And let's go ahead and look at that. I like to start with a map. Because we can talk a little bit about the founding of the nation. Now, in your U.S. history, you're going to get into this really in depth, but I like to draw a line of latitude right across here, because we can see here that the development of the northern colonies and the development of the southern colonies. Obviously, this is the south, this is the north. These colonies here were mostly settled by people leaving England during the English Civil War, seeking religious freedom. And many of you guys already know that. I'm going to write this right into here. You're not even going to see it. But what perhaps we don't know is that most of the southern colonies were founded for very different reasons. Most of the southern colonies were founded by English businessmen, right, who wanted to maintain their ties with the English and make money. England is a small island nation with a large population. They essentially ran out of land. People came to areas like this to make use of the farmland, right? So there's a very unique character in the north versus the south, and that trend continues, as I think you're well aware, throughout much of the history of the United States. In the 1760s, which is really the era that we want to be talking about, the American colonies have been in existence long enough for at least 2 generations of people to be living in the colonies, right? And to have never seen England before their entire lives. So these people really do have a new identity. That's a really important idea. Number 2, as the population grows rapidly, the economy is booming. Even at this time, things like cotton and tobacco were some of the best-selling items coming from the American colonies. And most of those things were coming from the South, but there was a large and powerful economy. It's also true to say that the American colonies were absolutely, positively English, and the people who inhabited those English colonies were English citizens, right? And so when we talk about English citizens, we're talking about, I don't even know what happened there. When we're talking about English citizens, we're talking about the rights and freedoms of an English person and the English Bill of Rights. So all of those English citizens were citizens of England and had those rights. Yeah? But even though they had these rights that all English citizens were supposed to have, they were oftentimes treated differently. The Navigation Acts is the first really sort of good example that describes how people living in the American colonies were ultimately treated differently than people living in England itself. And the Navigation Acts basically said that there is no principle of free enterprise in the American colonies. You cannot buy and sell freely. You cannot buy from who you wish. You cannot sell from who you wish. You must sell to England. You must buy from England. And so there was a lot of restrictions. A lot of people, even at that time, began to feel like this was a kind of breach of their rights. You can decide that for yourself. The other breaches that began to occur, and this is where we get into, John Locke, because what we're really talking about is this idea that the English Bill of Rights stood as a kind of social contract, right? and that in the 1760s, people were well versed in the ideas of John Locke and the Enlightenment, especially educated Americans. Let me go back here really quickly. They believed that the English Bill of Rights stood as a social contract, and so the more taxes and laws that were passed, like the Navigation Acts, the more people began to see a breakdown in that English social contract. So let's answer some of these questions. Why did the British tax the colonies? The number one reason why British taxed the colonies differently than they would tax all of their other colonial possessions is because of the French and Indian War. This was an extremely expensive war, fought thousands of miles away from England. The English King George III sent 10,000 soldiers to fight this war. It was bloody. It was costly. They fought both the French and the Native Americans. They eventually came to and signed it. They signed a treaty that ultimately said that the English would not go any further to the west, which a lot of American colonists felt like the west was, they were destined to go there. That's where we get the concept of manifest destiny. And so once again, we have the English law coming in and saying, nope, you can't go where you please, you can't do as you please. And then, not only that, the cost of the war, the English said, look, this is a huge cost to us. And so they begin taxing the colonists. Some of those taxes were, some of the well-known ones were the Stamp Act. Another one was the tea tax, which I think you guys are well familiar with. This one, everybody in the American colonies drank tea, so they all had to pay the tax. When people found out about this, the Sons of Liberty, which were, kind of a protest movement at the time, became a little bit more than just a protest movement. They broke into in Boston Harbor onto British ships, dumped tea into the harbor. You're familiar with the Boston Tea Party, I'm sure. And the British reacted by shutting down the harbor. So they created a kind of martial law in Boston, and the colonists then protested that. How did the British react? They reacted with martial law. How did the colonists react to that? They protested further. Those protests would eventually lead to one of the first conflicts between the British and the American colonists, which we know as the what is it called? I think it's in my next slide. I hope it's in my next slide. I think I've got a picture of it. There it is right there. The Boston Tea Party results in the Boston Massacre. That's what it is. So after the Boston Tea Party, the protests raged in the streets. There were American colonists throwing snowballs at British soldiers, and at least one of those snowballs may have had a few rocks in them, so they ultimately reacted violently and began shooting back at the colonists. 5 people were killed. Is that a massacre, or is that just a really good example of colonial propaganda? You be the judge. Anyway, the Stamp Act, the tea tax, these things ultimately led to the Boston Tea Party. Sam Adams, of course, you know him as the famous brewer, helped to organize these things. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty. And as this begins to erupt, the different colonies begin to elect representatives to represent them in something called the Continental Congress. So these colonists are not being represented in British Parliament because British Parliament is across the Atlantic Ocean. We talked about that, the idea that it's basically impossible for these people to participate in government. And so they begin electing their own representatives. They put together something called the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress sends a series of complaints to King George III. King George III ignores them. And so that just furthers a lot of the tension and the conflict between these groups. After the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre, the King George III ultimately repealed. Repealed means he took away all of these other laws. So he repealed the tea tax, repealed all of these different taxes. But in its place, he put something called the Intolerable Acts in place. And the Intolerable Acts were, well, intolerable. That means people could not put up with them. And the intolerable acts were essentially designed, once again, to ensure that the colonists kept in line. The colonists disliked the intolerable acts. So what did the intolerable acts do? The intolerable acts closed Boston Harbor. So many different people relied on Boston Harbor as, their principal way of making money. A lot of shipping went in and out of Boston Harbor. People relied on. Number two, it actually put the city of Boston in the hands of the British government. So the officials who governed Boston no longer had control in Boston. The third thing it did is the Quartering Act was part of this, which basically said the British said we're sick and tired of paying for our soldiers in America because they're so far away. So we're going to put them in your houses and you're going to pay the burden, right? In other words, the British government felt like it was saying, look, we pay for our soldiers to protect you. And if you don't want to pay for the soldiers to protect you by paying the tea tax, the Stamp Act, etc., then you're going to have to house the soldiers yourself. This is another reason why people just considered this to be absolutely intolerable, right? And ultimately, this led to the direct conflict between militias and the British military on the way between Lexington and Concord. So an American militia group ultimately began firing upon or got into a skirmish at Lexington. And whoops. I told you we'd have some mistakes here. And Concord. And this is where the revolution began. This is a famous document created by Benjamin Franklin. It was put in newspapers. It was actually put in the newspapers for the French and Indian War, but it was used again during the American Revolution. So anyway, 1775, between Lexington and Concord, the colonists first experienced or exchanged gunfire with the British. And there was still a lot of people who did not want to fight this war, but the war had already begun. In other words, the American colonists hadn't declared their independence. They hadn't justified this action. There was lots of people who relied on British relationships to conduct business, and yet some idiot in militia shot their rifles, causing a war between the people. And now, what were they to do but begin justifying the action? Luckily, they had a guy named Thomas Jefferson hanging around, who was quite the writer, wrote the Declaration of Independence. Nice. Luckily for Thomas Jefferson, he had James Madison before him, who wrote a charter for Virginia that was based on the work of none other than John Locke. And Jefferson received the work through Madison, but also read John Locke himself. And when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote almost word for word exactly what John Locke wrote, which is that people have the right to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness, right? He should have said property, because the Quartering Act was specifically taking away people's property. And, Jefferson's, Locke's idea was very clearly laid out. Anyway, so if we look at the three parts of, and we're not going to think of this as a warm-up, we're going to do this as an activity here. If we look at the three parts of the Declaration of Independence, we break it down. There's essentially three arguments. Number one is the establishment of certain natural rights that all people have. So that's one. If you go and you look at the work of John Locke, you can find those ideas sitting in John Locke's work where he says that people have certain rights. Suddenly stopped working. Two, governments are created. Governments are instituted or created among men to protect those rights. So again, same idea from John Locke. The reason why anyone would enter into society is for the protection of their property, the protection of their rights, right? Here, same idea. People create governments to secure their rights. Last but not least, third part of the argument, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends here, giving you rights, protecting your rights, etc., when they become destructive of those ends, it is your right to alter or to abolish it, right? So clear justification for these American colonists. The intolerable acts, the Stamp Act, tea tax, all of these issues ultimately led to the American colonists seeing that there was a clear and justified reason that the English, not the American colonists, the English broke the social contract, therefore justifying their right to create new government. So, really quickly, what were the three main ideas in the Declaration of Independence? Number one, the idea of natural rights. Number two, governments are created to protect your rights. Number three, governments that don't protect your rights should be destroyed. Abolished. Destroyed is such a strong word. Anyway, you get the idea. Let's go ahead and move on. So what is unique about the American Revolution? The American Revolution is the first revolution. It is the first war fought for the sake of Enlightenment principles. That's what's unique about the American Revolution. It is the first war fought for Enlightenment principles. How has it impacted the rest of the world? There are more governments today based on the American Constitution, based on the principles of the American Revolution and the ideas of our system of government than there are any other system in the world. We're going to continue to look at that and see that. I don't want to focus on this too much. This is important information. Take a moment to pause the video if you want to write this information down, because it is important to know. The one thing I will say is that ultimately, the colonists in America were successful in fighting this revolution, not because they had truth, justice, and the American way on their side, but because the British had to fight a war 3,000 miles away from their home, and that was incredibly expensive. Next, the Americans were able to get the French to fight on their side, which made it even harder because the French had a huge navy that could help us prevent the British from blockading our ports. These two things made it much more likely that we were going to win. Last but not least, we used untraditional methods of warfare, like guerrilla-style warfare, rather than, walking in straight lines and killing each other. So, the success of the colonists relied very heavily on the French and on, distance. Consider what you know about the war in Afghanistan. Whether we won or lost that war is kind of moot, right? Because in the end, the Afghan people will take their country back and formulate whatever government they want, right? We were there for 14 years. We have military and technology and money to do whatever we want, and yet, in the end, it's too far away for us to stay there forever. That's kind of the same issue with the American colonies. The first time the Americans in this is in the conventions following the revolution, the first time we developed a system of government, it was a failure. Let that be a lesson to all of you. Even the Americans failed the first time, right? We created a document called the Articles of Confederation. What it did is it created an incredibly weak federal government. By the way, federal is synonymous with central. It's synonymous with national. Those all mean the same thing. National. They all mean the same thing. Okay, and they contrast versus state governments. Right? So there's state power and federal power. We liked the idea of state power. Okay? because these colonies were used to governing themselves, being a thousand miles away from Britain. We were wary. We were afraid of the idea of federal power, right? A central government that takes too much power. So the first time we created a government that had an incredibly weak national government. It had no power. I'll give you a few examples. States could create their own currencies, which meant when you moved from Virginia to New York or any other colony, each of these places were using different money, like literally completely different currencies, different designs, things like that, different exchange rates. They had different laws, they had different rules, they had different taxes, they had tariffs across borders. There's a whole host of things that made the economic growth of the United States basically come to a screeching halt because states had more power than the federal government. And that proved to be a serious problem. Ultimately, when we would go to, in 1787, when people realized this was a huge problem, they had the Constitutional Convention, which was ultimately a convention designed to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, but people realized it was such a failure that they decided to rewrite it. It took 4 months, and what they ended up producing was the Constitution. And the Constitution would solve this problem of having a weak national government by deciding to create a system that has a federal system, where there's a balance of power between the federal government and the state government. So the Americans tried to figure out a way to balance those powers, right? The other thing is that people were deathly afraid that the federal government was going to end up taking too much power. So he used the ideas of Charles Montesquieu to make sure that we put a system of checks and balances in place to ensure that that federal government never took on too much power. So that was a big part of appeasing people. I'm going to skip the Bill of Rights really quickly. I'm going to come back to it. So when the U.S. Constitution was written, it was written with 6 articles originally. The first 3 articles were the powers of the legislative, judicial, and executive branch, and it also clearly outlined the limits of their power and how their power would be put in check. The 4th article was the concept of federalism, which is the idea of you're going to have certain rights for the federal government, but you're also going to have certain rights and powers that only states have. And that was a really unique idea. Number 5. The Article 5 said that we were going to continue to pay all of our debts. It said that it said that the Constitution of the United States would be the supreme law of the land. Important idea. And then last but not least, Article 6 was based on the principle of ratification. So basically what this was is, in order for the Constitution to even be created, now that it's written, for it to be the law of the land, it has to be sent to all of the new 13 states, and they have to ratify it by a 2/3 majority. The first time the Constitution went out to those 13 colonies, it was not ratified, because most of those colonists, most of those Americans, were used to having a list or a bill of rights, and the Constitution didn't have that bill or list of rights. So, they had to bring the Constitution back, revise it, add in the first 10 amendments in order to appease people who felt that, they needed a Bill of Rights. There's an argument to be made that you don't want a Bill of Rights. We can talk about that later in class. You can ask that question. Why did Alexander Hamilton argue we shouldn't have a Bill of Rights? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Ultimately, Americans couldn't handle it because they were used to the English Bill of Rights, and so they said, listen, we need to have a Bill of Rights. So that's exactly what we did. Let's go ahead and look at what those rights are. So the first 10 really quickly. The first one is freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, and assembly, right? This is Voltaire. I hope you guys realize this is Voltaire. Yeah? We're not going to put limits on your freedom of speech or your ability to practice your religion. Number 2, we realized that ultimately it was militias that allowed us to win the war against the British. So we relied very heavily on militias. We actually didn't have a uniform military when the war broke out, when the American Revolution broke out. We didn't have a standing army. So we continued to believe that the right to bear arms was an essential right. Amendment 3 was literally, again, you can see it's very reactionary. It's an amendment that all of us have, and yet it's not anything we think about because no one's doing any quartering, meaning no one's going to put a soldier up in your house. 4, this comes from Cesare Beccaria, right? But it also comes from John Locke. right? Your property is sacred, and no authority, the federal government or state government, can come onto that property unless they have a warrant, probable cause to search the property. Amendment 5, these are Cesare Beccaria, right? This guy who wrote about how laws are there to achieve social order. Laws should not unduly punish people. So here in Amendment 5, this is the one that says you have the right to remain silent, right? The Fifth Amendment. When people say, I plead the Fifth, you must be accused of a crime to be put on a trial, no double jeopardy, things like that. Amendment 6, this is Beccaria, Cesare Beccaria. Everybody has the right to speedy and public trial. Did I skip 7? I did. We'll come back to it. Okay, so 8, no excessive bail, fines, cruel or unusual punishments. You know who this is coming from. We talked about that extensively in class. Amendment 9. This should be everybody's favorite amendment. This was actually heavily influenced by Alexander Hamilton, who said that you don't want to actually have a Bill of Rights, because once you have a Bill of Rights, once you start listing your rights, eventually people are going to think that those are the only rights that you have. So you don't want your rights listed. What you want instead is to just have something that says all the things that you can't do. Like, we'll make a list of the things you can't do, and then everything else you can do. Well, that's exactly what Amendment 9 does. It says, just because we've listed your rights, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others. So you still have the right even though it's not listed. And then Amendment 10, what is not listed for the federal government, states can do. So it's like an elastic clause for states. There's your 10 amendments. I think you can see quite clearly that John Locke, the English Enlightenment thinker, was instrumental in helping to create the Declaration of Independence and also certain aspects of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I think you can see quite clearly that Cesare Beccaria was instrumental in giving us certain rights and freedoms in the Bill of Rights. I think that you can also see that even people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, when you look at the argument of federalism, right, and how do we figure out ways to limit the government, is influential here. Obviously, Charles Montesquieu, in the first 3 articles of the Constitution, we create a separation of powers and checks and balances. So all of these ideas are there. I know this has gone on long enough, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it right there. But before I stop, I will ask you one question. In what way, shape, or form has Mary Wollstonecraft informed our Constitution? Because she has, just not at the time of the Revolution. All right. Please let me know if you like this format. I'm going to upload this to Google Classroom so you can access it whenever you need. And let me know what you think.